ourselves on traditional Mississauga First Nations land. And second of all, I'd like to welcome you all and thank you for coming to Beyond Toronto's Transit Crisis toward a red green vision for our city. We're very excited to have you here and looking forward to a great discussion. We have 4 speakers who are sitting over here, and we hope to have a participatory conversation about how to build the Toronto transit movement after the speakers have had their turn. My name is Kamila Pietschuk. I am a member of the Greater Toronto Workers' Assembly, which is a local socialist anti-capitalist organization. The Greater Toronto Workers' Assembly has 2 active campaigns. One is a public sector campaign, and there will be an event later today that will maybe advertise after our discussion later. And the other campaign is the campaign for free and accessible public transit, of which I have been part since its inception, I think about 2.5 years ago now. I am also a member of TTC Writers. We have Jessica Bell, who will be speaking on behalf of that organization, and we will be encouraging you to join that organization, but more on that later. So I'll hand it over to Stefan Kipfer, who will talk from the perspective of the free and accessible transit campaign.
Well, thanks to you all for coming, and thanks Camilla for organizing. I should say that I won't be able to speak to the specifics of the campaign, but I'll save since I've joined fairly recently, so questions should directly to more long-standing members, including yourself. That would matter. But I'd like to say a few words about both the short-term and the long-term promises of the demand for free transit. Perhaps by analogy, we start off with a couple of words about the Quebec student strike last year, which certainly was one of the most impressive moments in recent political history on this continent. The interesting thing about that campaign is it started as a very concrete, relatively unremarkable campaign simply against tuition increases. But in the course of the impressive mass mobilizations that ensued, it became clear that the movement was about much more than that. It became an entry point for critique of neoliberalism more generally, and it became ultimately also a movement not just to make higher education more accessible, but to change what it is. So various people particularly the class and the more radical wing of the student movement, people proposed a different kind of education system in the course of the mobilization. Right? And so the relatively concrete demand for freezing tuition or even eliminating it became also a demand for a university system that wouldn't be primarily about feeding knowledge workers into the global economy and subsidizing corporate-oriented research. It became a demand for a different kind of education system. And so it may be possible to think of the concrete demand for free transit both as a very pragmatic and useful immediately concrete demand. That may also be a starting point to think about a different way of moving about and perhaps changing society. There's actually, I'm quoting here the Socialist Alliance from Australia, which in a previous program on transit in that country, in New South Wales specifically, suggested just that sustainable transportation perhaps could be a way to think about changing society as a whole. So let me kind of speculate a bit on that with respect to free transit. Now, the demand for free transit is not in and of itself a revolutionary demand. You may well know that there are dozens of small and mid-sized cities around the world, particularly in Europe, which already have free transit. More recently, the capital of Estonia, Tallinn, became the first larger city to also go that route, eliminating fares from their transit system. I suppose the question is, why does the demand seem a bit ambitious in a Toronto context today? And I think that has more to do with Toronto than with the demand for free transit. I think we can discuss this later, but it's certainly true that whereas in the mid-1970s, Toronto was often cited as one of the more promising transit systems on this continent at least, perhaps not beyond, but certainly on this continent. That is no longer the case. Arguably, we've become a bit of a backwater with respect to transportation issues for various reasons. And I think it's in that context that a demand for free transit can look radical in our context here in Toronto. The two dominant positions on transit today, if I generalize in the region of Toronto, not just in the city of Toronto, are the following. I mean, the first one is the pro-car position, which typically doesn't need to advertise itself. It goes without saying, for the most part, in most parts of the Toronto region, outside of central Toronto, that the car rules. And you don't need to make a big political statement out of it. It's just a matter of fact. This is the way things are, right, for the most part. Now, occasionally, somebody like Ford comes along and tries to make a virtue out of that position, right, suggesting essentially that, yeah, we may have some subways, but really, at the end of the day, a lot of transit is an obstacle to the car, and to the extent that we want transit that doesn't impede car transportation, right? That's sort of his position. It's a very old position that goes back to the 1920s on this continent, and it's one that is unfortunately quite widespread in terms of its resonance with a lot of people's everyday lives, particularly in the 90s. Now, the other position, which is filling a lot of airspace and media space in the Toronto Star, the Globe and Mail, and so on and so forth, is a kind of a transit rationalism. There's a position which says, yes, to only rely on a car is a problem. And it's primarily a problem for economic competitiveness. It costs us, business leaders and organizers and enterprises, a lot of money to have workers stuck in traffic, to have congestion, to have health costs that are associated with car transportation. So we need some rational transit system as a supplement, not as an alternative to the car, but as a supplement to car transportation in the GTA. And of course, this is the position that is taken by Metrolinx, the provincial agency. This is the position of the Board of Trade of Toronto, and a series of other important opinion makers in Toronto. More recently, there's been a shift towards seeing transportation as an opportunity for privatization. It's an emerging consensus that includes even some elements of progressive politics to see Metrolinx and this very selective transit expansion as an opportunity to gradually privatize the expansion, then the operation, and perhaps ultimately the organization of transit in this region. So this is sort of where we stand in the Toronto region. And I think in this context, the demand for free transit raises some immediately short-term positive prospects for transportation. Let me highlight four things very quickly. Access, the importance of transit workers, and the public sector. Who would benefit immediately from a free transit system in the GTA? Well, a lot of people. I mean, the transit geography in Toronto is complex. Downtown Toronto and parts of the GO system are very much a cross-class system. But there's certainly the people who would benefit most from going to a free transit system are the people who are most transit dependent, who have least choice to use the car or use an alternative to transit. And that's where the free transit demand, of course, is a demand about social justice. Who would benefit most? Well, everyone who's been affected most by the opposite trends, by increases to fares, by cuts to services, by a general lack of investment in transit in the GTA. The young and the elderly, right? People least mobile. Women who tend to have a very significantly higher average transit dependency than men, very significant difference actually. And most importantly, I think from a working class perspective, the most precarious elements of the working class. Those who can't afford a car, those who are most stuck in either unemployment or precarious short-term contract employment, and a significant portion of that most precarious fraction of the working class, which is mostly composed of people of color, tend to live in the inner suburbs, right? So North York, Etobicoke, parts of North York, parts of Etobicoke, parts of Scarborough, and various parts of the 905, parts of Brampton, parts of Mississauga, even little pockets in South Markham and Durham region, right? So this part of the working class would benefit most from moving to a free transit system. Now, what about transit workers? Right? It may be counterintuitive to think that transit workers are beneficiaries from a free transit system, because the free transit system would immediately take out hundreds of millions of dollars from the operating revenues of the existing transit agencies. And so if you only think of the short term, perhaps this is a problem. But certainly even in the midterm, transit workers themselves could easily be seen as some of the major beneficiaries of the free transit system, because, first of all, the free transit system wouldn't work without expanding service. Increased demand, you'd have to increase service, you'd have to have more transit workers, which is a good thing for people working in the system. Second of all, one of the growing, I think, sources of tension between transit workers and transit riders, which you all are familiar with probably as an everyday occurrence, is because increasingly rising fares has put transit workers, bus drivers, fare collectors in a position to police the fare, in a position to make sure that nobody scams the system. And if you take the fare out of the equation, transit workers are no longer have to be involved in this policing role, which would be a great way to kind of get rid of one of the sources of conflict between riders and workers. So that's sort of the second one. The third point, simply about the public sector and the transit system. In the short term, moving to a free transit system would certainly increase transit use a bit, hardly dramatically probably, but it would increase it a bit. And so it would move us into the right direction in terms of moving a bit further towards a transit-oriented transportation system, and a bit more away from a car-oriented one. And ultimately, I think this is only possible within a public system. It's very unlikely in the Toronto context that you could build a free transit system with public-private partnerships. Which transnational company would put in a bid for a fareless transit system? I'm not sure. I'd like to see that. So at that level, to argue for a free transit system is actually also almost inevitably an argument for expanding and building upon the existing elements of the public transit system that we have. So this is all short-term stuff, and I think this is, in the short term, these are some important short-term arguments for a fareless system. But it may be possible to also think in the long term, to think that a free, sustainable transit system may be an entry point to think about a different city, to think about a different society, to think about a different way of life. Certainly, a free transit system may get us to think about not only a more accessible transit system, but it may force us to think about what kind of transportation system we want beyond one that's free. It may also provide us an opportunity to think about reorganizing our lives in such a way as it's no longer captured by both neoliberal economic policies, but perhaps even by various capitalist imperatives in the long term. Because the current positions around transit, the pro-car one and the sort of the transit rationalist position by Metrolinx, both of these positions are essentially productivist. They may disagree about how we get around, what the proper mix is between transit and car-oriented transportation, but they all agree that we should get around to get to places that we don't control. That we need to have a system which is as efficient as possible, moving us from private sphere to private sphere, from domestic space to work to shopping. Right? The system that is most efficient in this context is one that connects us best to areas of life that are dominated by capitalist imperatives. And moreover, if you can throw in an opportunity to treat transportation as a source of profit, as an industry in the car industry, in the sense of the car industry, and a source of profit for privatization, the better. So existing positions on transit are productive, on transportation are productivist, largely, whether or not they are interested in expanding public transportation. One could counterpose those positions with a red-green position, an ecologically socialist position, which recognizes that at the end of the day, human needs and the integrity of the non-human environment on this planet cannot be met within the context of a capitalist society. It's only been about 200, 250 years that capitalism has been dominated the world in a systematic way. And it's over those 200 years that human society has come to the point of impacting the very geological formation of this planet. To continue with this trend is a recipe for disaster and radical changes in order, and I think transportation can be part of it. Now, what is a red-green politics? What is ecological socialism? I mean, this is a long debate, and one inspiration that I've had recently is a book by Michael Levy, who wrote a book in French called Eco-Socialism. So I'm going to make a few points out of that. But I mean, his understanding of eco-socialism is that it's a double transformation of certain kinds of socialisms and certain kinds of ecological politics. Eco-socialism is an approach that is very much aligned with certain strands of green politics, but disagrees with those kinds of green politics that are indifferent to social justice, that are indifferent to the deep class, race, gender inequalities that shape our society. At the same time, a red-green position is also a critique of those traditions and the socialist traditions that have been overly optimistic about technology, about progress, and have been less concerned with the relationship between humans and non-humans on this planet. So the red-green position is a kind of a new synthesis of both socialist traditions and green traditions. And what he's suggesting, Michael Levy, is that really red-green politics is a politics for a new civilization, a new way of life, defined by a very deep egalitarianism, a very deep attitude towards equality between men and women, it's a vision for a classless society and a vision for a globally just society. It's a vision for international solidarity, it's a vision for internationalism. At the same time, red-green politics also is about seeing the connections between a good human life and respect for the non-human environment. I have found that? Yeah, that's perfect. And so that sort of essentially encapsulates really what one can understand by red-green politics. And perhaps we can talk about it a little more in a minute. I just want to draw some implications from all of this for transportation, right? To conclude. So, following this logic, what are the broader implications, perhaps, of a different, free, sustainable transportation system? Well, in the first instance, global climate justice. Right? You may well know that car-oriented sprawl, particularly on this continent, but more broadly in Europe and North America, is one of the major drivers of global climate injustice today, in a very deep structural sense. And so one of the best things we can think about in terms of having a global impact, in terms of making it possible for other peoples on this planet to live a more decent life, is to radically change the way we do things in our urban regions here. And transportation has to be part of it. To move from a car-oriented towards a transit-oriented system has huge promises in terms of reducing the way in which we relate to the planet and the non-human environment. And indeed, it has geopolitical promises. It has promises to change the relationships between different parts of an imperially dominated planet. So global climate justice is one of the sort of one of the kind of longer-term horizons that one can make by extrapolating from the free transit system. The second one has to do with economic development strategies in our own countries and regions. Why not think of a free transit system as a way to develop green jobs? Why not think of a free and expanded transit system as a way to increase public investment and use the public sector as a way to expand jobs in transit infrastructure, in manufacturing plants that produce everything from bicycles to cars and trains. Why not see the free transit approach as a kind of a connecting point to rethink economic development strategies? Thirdly, transit justice. This is a term that is actually now quite widespread. It has become quite widespread in the United States over the last sort of 20, 30 years. And a free transit system does sort of get us to think about a bit, well, what would be a transit system that is less riddled by inequality, that is used much more equally and that doesn't discriminate systematically against transit riders, but also certain people who are using transit and are not having a good time doing it. People waiting for half an hour for a bus in Scarborough, or people being harassed by transit cops of the transit system. Transit justice, an important agenda that emerged again in the United States. And it's important for us to think about it because today, increasingly, I think I have a sense that Toronto has arrived at a point where transit policy people in the province of Ontario are increasingly thinking of using systems like the TDC, which is in the Toronto area responsible for about 80% of all transit ridership. Using that system as a way to redistribute transit investment across the GTA. And that may possibly have major implications for who gets to use transit for what purpose. It may well take investment dollars away from the people who are most dependent on transit. Again, in the central suburbs of Toronto, for example, or pockets of the 905. We don't know yet, but it's an important thing for us to think about. Who gets to use transit and how is an important question. Final point, city building. Free transit system may well get us to the point of rethinking the way in which we organize our cities. We can think of a free transit system as a way to significantly expand public space. Transit system is in principle, collective transportation is one of the few spaces that we use, that we get across every day that are in principle public spaces. And I think a free transit system would make those spaces much more public than the way they are now. Building compact cities as opposed to sprawling cities, the way in which we've been doing it for the last generation, very important. This is, everybody is kind of on that level playing, on that plane at the moment. There's this idea that we need to intensify and build more compact cities. But a free transit system, a red-green approach to transit may also want to think about, may want to get us to think about the fact that to build compact cities by private real estate creates a lot of problems and actually make it impossible in the long term to build compact cities. We can perhaps discuss this in discussion, but certainly a right-wing approach would question the way in which policymakers have been thinking about intensifying cities by building condominium towers all over the place, which has been the dominant way in which the province and the city of Toronto has been thinking about it in the last little while. And finally, perhaps we may want to think about free transit not simply as a way to make it possible for more and more people to travel around more and more every day, but we may want to think about it as an element in building slow cities. It's an expression that is increasingly used in Europe, for example, not always in a very radical way, but nonetheless suggestive. A free transit system could make us think about both making transit more accessible and more widespread, but also organizing cities and organizing our spaces and working lives in such a way as fewer and fewer of us are actually forced to commute all the time. Right? There is such a thing called forced mobility that a lot of us are suffering from. And perhaps to think of a free transit system in sort of a red-green way is perhaps also a way for us to think about not only the capacity to be mobile, which should be recognized as a right, but also the capacity not to rush around from 5:30 in the morning till 9 o'clock in the evening. So I'll just put that out there as perhaps the last point.